Hello. Before we begin, a quick note. The Boy to Sleep podcast relies on you and sponsors, which means you will hear a quick advertisement before the beginning of tonight's episode. While the podcast is free, you are welcome to subscribe for just $2.99 per month, which supports the creation of this podcast and gives you an ad-free listening experience. Simply click the link in the show notes from your podcast app. Rest easy. Hello. Welcome to the Bore You to Sleep podcast. The podcast that will hopefully help you get to sleep. I am going to read an open source book, one that is not particularly interesting, but one that is hopefully boring enough to get you to sleep. Tonight's reading comes from The Happy Tree, written by Rosalind Murray and published in 1926. This story takes place in London, shortly after the First World War. My name is Teddy, and I aim to help people everywhere get a good night's rest. Sleep is so important, and my mission is to help you get the rest you need. The podcast is designed to play in the background while you slowly fall asleep. For those new to the podcast, it started from my own struggles with sleep. I wanted to create a resource for others facing similar challenges, and I'm so grateful for the amazing community we've built together. This podcast is self-made and self-produced, which is why you'll hear a short ad at the beginning of each episode. These ads, along with support from subscribers and patrons, enable me to keep delivering this podcast for free to those who need it. Thank you to everybody who shared their words of gratitude with me during the week, whether through the boytosleep.com website or your podcast app. Your messages mean the world to me. A special thanks to all new subscribers to the podcast and all existing subscribers and Patreon sponsors. My goal is to keep this podcast free and accessible to everyone. If you find the podcast beneficial and would like to support it, here are a few ways you can contribute. Follow the podcast in your app and leave a comment. Become a subscriber for $2.99 per month. That will remove the ad at the beginning of the episode and, importantly, support episode creation. If subscribing is not possible, and I completely understand if it is not, an easy way to help is simply by leaving a review and rating in your podcast app. Even one sentence really helps out. If you would like to support the show or simply say hello, you can always do that at boytosleep.com. In the meantime, lie back, relax, and enjoy the readings. The Happy Tree by Rosalind Murray. Part 1. Green Felicity. Leaves are falling down like the laburnum tree at the gate. Yellow leaves, white gate, and red brick of the houses opposite. It is very ugly. In the spring the flowers are yellow instead of the leaves, and the hawthorn bush to the side is bright pink, and across the road is lilac. The red brick houses have facings of yellow stone, squares of yellowish stone round the doors and the windows. All the colours are wrong, all the shapes are ugly, even the trees are not real trees. Once I would have minded it so much to live here, looking out at that laburnum tree and that house opposite, that bow window, and the yellowish stone facings of the windows, and the lilac bush that has grown all crooked, and the pink hawthorn, and the laurels with patterned leaves. But now I do not mind. Now I do not see these things or think about them at all. Only tonight I am seeing them, because somehow I have come awake tonight for a bit. Tonight I realize that for 9 years I have lived here, looking at that house every time I go out, and have never really noticed it before. But even now that I see it, I do not mind. I do not mind about anything very much now except, I suppose, John. Tomorrow I shall be 40. My youth is gone, irretrievably, irrevocably gone. And even that I do not mind. It used to seem to me so difficult not to feel too much, and now I cannot feel at all. Is this simply growing old? Is this what always happens when one grows old? But if Hugo were alive still, would it be like this? I do not think that it would. Tonight things come back to me very clearly, in an odd, detached way. Things that have happened to me as though they had happened to somebody else while I looked on. Yearsley comes back to me much more than usual, and Guy and Hugo and our childhood there. Some things I have been almost afraid of thinking about too much. Now I can think of everything and am not afraid. It is like what I have heard happens when people are going to die. Is being 40 like that? Does it mean that I do mind being 40, though I think I don't? Hugo said that we must hold out till the end. I have had to hold out longer than he did, and it has seemed often that if I let myself think or feel much, I couldn't do it. That was before this deadening came that makes it easier, but now I am not afraid. Something is past, some danger is past, and now I know that I shall be able to hold out till the end. I do not believe in immortality, and yet I feel somehow that Hugo will know if I keep my promise. Walter is in bed, asleep, and I am by the window, alone. There is a bright moon coming up now behind the houses opposite, and in the moonlight the colours are changing. The yellow and red grow paler and less violent. Even on this road there comes a quiet and beauty of the night. And my life up to now comes before me very clearly. The people and the places and the choices and mistakes. And I seem to see it all in better proportion than before, less clouded and blurred across by the violent emotion of youth. Guy and Hugo and Cousin Delia and Sophia Lane Watson and Diana and Walter and George Addington and Molly and Yearsley and Hampstead, and here, but Hugo goes through it all. When I try to think of my life without Hugo, it is impossible. It is as though there were nothing there at all. And really, so little has happened to me. My life has been a very ordinary one. No adventures, nothing dramatic, just the same sort of life as most of the women I meet in the street, and think so dull. The lady who lives opposite, in the house with the bow window, has 3 grown-up sons and 2 daughters. She is much older than I am. Her life must have had more in it than mine. Does it seem to her, I wonder, as intricate and as poignant as mine does to me? I suppose that it does when she thinks about it, and I suppose that it is only seldom, just as it is with me. Perhaps before her 50th and 60th birthdays, she thought about it, and perhaps she thought it very interesting. I wonder if I should think so too, if she told me. The beginning is Yearsley. People say that places ought not to matter, still less houses, but I think they do. Yearsley has mattered to me, and it did to Guy and Hugo. It stood for something very stable, very enduring, and very sympathetic. Yearsley without Cousin Delia might have been something quite different. It is quite different now, but I think of them together, complementary to each other. Cousin Delia's personality pervaded everything at Yearsley, and everything there seemed somehow an enhancement and expression of her, and yet each was distinct. Yearsley had something that it had long before she came there, and Cousin Delia had something, and a great deal that she must have had before she came, and would have had wherever she was. She has it now. The house at Yearsley was of grey stone. It was a long plain house built at the beginning of the 18th century, with a door in the middle and a row of high sash windows on either side of the door. Above this was a second row of windows, and a kind of classical stone cornice overhung the upper windows. The roof was steeper than is usual in such houses, and was also grey slates or chips of stone, with patches of green moss on them. Once it had been a much bigger house, with a long bedroom, wing stretching back northwards at the east end of the house, but that had been burnt down in 1830, and never rebuilt. And when I first remember it, this centre block was the entire house. In the middle of the house was a hall, stretching from back to front, and the two main doors, the front door to the north and the garden door to the south, faced each other across it. Standing on the south side of the house, you could look right through to the clouds at the north. The garden door stood open almost always, except in winter. The hall reached up to the top of the house, and the big staircase wound up and round it, ending in a square wooden gallery from which the bedrooms opened. In front of the house, the garden front stretched a long lawn, with a wide gravel path down the middle. At the end of the path 6 stone steps led down to a lower lawn where we played tennis. And at the top of the steps, one on each side, stood 2 lead statues, one of Diana with a bow, and the other, a hero leaning forward with a shield. The lead of the statues was perishing away, and there was a great crack across Diana's head, but they stood out clear and almost black from all the south windows of the house. Below the tennis court was a piece of meadow sloping down to the Mallock River, with its 2 lines of willows, flowing at this point due east, and almost parallel with the front of the house. A little further on it turned sharply southward, wandering away through the low-lying meadows beyond the hill. At the east end of the house were beech trees. The nearest grew within a few feet of the wall, and their branches threw green lights and shadows into the end windows, and filled the rooms on windy nights with a swishing sound like the sea. Further from the house, the trees thickened up into the highwood, which stretched along the side of the hill, southward above the course of the river for a little way. This wood was a particular home for us. We played in the streets like birds or squirrels, and built great nests of sticks in which we sat. We had special trees too, good trees and bad trees, which seemed to us like people. There was one in particular, a very big one, which we called the happy tree, and that we loved the best. Hugo had given it the name, lying on his back one summer's day, his bare feet kicking on the moss. On a drear nighted December, to happy, happy tree, thy branches near remember, their green felicity, green felicity, green felicity, green felicity. He kept chanting the words, beating softly on the moss with his feet. The pale green sunlight flickered through the world of beech leaves onto his face. His hands were clasped behind his head, and his dark blue jersey was open at the neck. "It is green felicity," Guy, halfway up among the branches, said. "What are you saying?" And Hugo answered, "Green felicity," and then, "On a drear nighted December, to happy, happy tree." Oh, Guy said, "Well, I suppose so, but I don't see why too happy." And I just said, "But it just is." And Hugo said, "It just is." "All right," Guy answered, "too happy if you like." And afterwards we always called it the happy tree. Below the trees the hillside was smooth and green. A grass path had been cut in it many years ago when the house was newly built. In those days all the hillside had been kept closely mown, but in our time the grass grew long and was made into hay. Only the path was kept still a little shorter than the rest. We used to race along it. There was room for two abreast, but it was not wide enough for three. The path ended in a little stone pavilion, which we called the temple. Why we called it so, no one could remember. It had 4 glass doors and steps all round. Inside there was a mosaic table and 4 statues in the niches between the doors. The doors were always locked, for the roof was unsafe, and nobody ever went inside. Only Guy could remember going inside once with Cousin John, when an architect or expert of some sort came to look at it. At the other end of the house, to the west, was the walled garden, and in the sunny corner between the end wall of the house and the garden wall was the rose garden that Cousin Delia had made. In that there was a sundial and some little stone putty, and there most often we would find her. When I think of Yearsley in those long days ago, I think very often of her in the rose garden, with her long gardening gloves and shady hat, and the half-smile with which she would look up when one of us called to her, and her quiet grey eyes in the shadow of her hat. She was never in a hurry and never too busy to answer questions. If we wanted her, she was always there. I used to wonder, even then, how it was she had so much time, for my own mother was always busy. I wonder even more now. Cousin Delia was very quiet, but she never oppressed us nor made it seem wrong to make a noise. as so many people who were quiet did so. I think it was partly that she was not quiet on purpose or with an effort, but simply from a form of serenity. She was happy, I am sure, and people round her were happy. My mother once said it surprised her that a woman of Delia's intelligence should be contented with such an idle, stagnant life. I felt very angry, even then, and tried to defend her, though I don't think I managed to explain what I meant. The truth was, I think, that she was never idle. Only the things she did were not the kind of things that my mother would count. She was interested in so many things, in flowers and animals, and little precious things in the house, little pieces of china, or even old chairs. They seemed to have a value for her which they had not for other people, not as objects, but almost as friends. They lived and felt and were real for her. You could see it from the way she touched them. And then, of course, she had Guy and Hugo. And they meant so much to her than I ever meant to my mother. Beyond the rose garden was the old wall, high and baked and a little bulging in places. Big espalier apple trees were trained across it, and pear trees too. There were 2 wrought iron doors that led into the walled garden. One led out of the rose garden, and the other, in the centre of the wall, was called the Jasmine Gate, because of a great bush of white jasmine, which hung round it and over the wall. Inside the wall there were more fruit trees, apples and pears again, and plums and cherries. There were also currant bushes covered up in nets and vegetables of all sorts. And then there were flowers. A wide herbaceous border ran the length of the north wall, and it seems to me, even now, that the flowers in that border were brighter and bigger than any other flowers. One year, too, there was a big clump of sunflowers, giant sunflowers, in a corner, away from the main border, and we made a house under the broad leaves, at least Hugo and I did, but Gary laughed at us, for he was older, and he thought it silly. It was not a real house, like our house in the wood, he said, but Guy never laughed in a way that we could mind. In the middle of the walled garden was a small round pond with a fountain in the middle. The fountain hardly ever played, but there were frogs in the pond, surprising quantities of frogs, and we used to call it the Frog Pond. Twice we saw a mouse there too, on the little island of stones and weeds in the middle, where the spout of the fountain was. The mouse was running about among the stones, picking up something from under the weeds, and then it met a frog sitting stolidly on a stone, and it jumped back suddenly. We lay on our stomachs at the edge of the pond for a long time, watching for the mouse to come back, and then it was dinner time, and we had to go in. We only saw it once again, though we watched it for often, but the question of how it got there and how it got away occupied us a great deal, and its existence imparted a new interest to the pond. Inside the house there was a special smell that I have never met anywhere else. It was a sweet, clean smell, and faint. What it came from exactly, it would be hard to say. Lavender and potpourri, and old polished floors and old brocade. Sweet and faint and slightly pungent. Sometimes I have caught whiffs of smells in other places that were just a little like it, and they have brought Yeasley back to me more vividly, and suddenly anything else, as though I had just come in by the garden door, and were standing in the hall. The drawing room was on the left of the door, as you went in from the garden. It was a very long room, with 4 tall windows along the side and one at the end, and there were 2 fireplaces with high chimney pieces, white marble with carved figures in faint relief, and over the chimney pieces were high mirrors that reflected back the green of the garden from the windows facing them. There were yellow brocade curtains, very old and faded, and white shield-backed chairs upholstered in the same yellow brocade. The room had been redecorated for our great-grandmother, Mary Geraldine, when she came as a bride to Yeasley in 1802, and it had hardly been altered since her death 8 years later. A portrait of her by Jackson hung between the 2 fireplaces, and there was a miniature of her on a little gilt nail by the further fireplace as well. A dark-eyed, laughing face, very charming, very romantic. There was an atmosphere of romance all about her, since her death in Spain when she was 26. She had followed her husband to the Peninsular War and died of fever there. Her body had been embalmed and sent home to be buried at Yeasley, and the story was told of how, when the coffin was opened, it was seen that her hair had gone on growing after death, long black hair flowing down her knees, wrapping her around like a great black shawl. Our great-grandfather had been a little boy, barely 7 years old, but this sight he remembered naturally enough, and he had told it to his children, Guy and Hugo's grandfather and my grandmother. My grandmother had told it to us. This impressed us very much and increased the indefinable glamour surrounding our young great-grandmother. Her husband had preserved everything after her death exactly as she had left it, and so it had remained down to our time. There were her handkerchiefs and pieces of lace, her little volumes of Italian poetry. Even chairs and tables remained where she had put them. Yet it was a happy sentimentality. There was no sense of a dead hand in the cult of Mary Geraldine. If Cousin Delia's own personality was gradually, quite imperceptibly, superseding the fainter older one, it was not deliberately nor of set purpose at all. The 2 personalities, quite distinct and different in themselves, seemed to blend and merge harmoniously, and Yeasley was the richer for both. Cousin Delia never scolded and never disappointed. It seems to me, when I think of that time now, and there were no rules at Yeasley, no forbidden places, nothing we might not do. It seems now as though we had done just what we liked all the day long, only somehow we did not want to do naughty things. To begin with, we did not quarrel. I cannot remember any quarrel between Guy and Hugo, except once, over a dead robin, when Guy called the cat who killed it cruel, and Hugo insisted that it was not cruel, because it did not understand. Even then they had not fought, but their voices had been angry, and that was very rare. We did not want to annoy each other or other people, as my children so often do. We did not want to disobey, but then there were no rules to disobey. Sometimes I have thought that it was easy for Cousin Delia, because Guy and Hugo were so little trouble, and so easy to manage, and that I could manage my own children that way, if they had been like them, but this explanation is not enough. Guy and Hugo would not have been so good with another mother. They were not very good at school, and I know that I was often naughty when I was not at Yearsley. I know that it was something in Cousin Delia herself that made the atmosphere, a kind of active peace and contentment that affected us, as it affected the animals and flowers she had. She did not play with us often. She seldom took us for walks. She left us much more alone to ourselves than I was ever left at my grandmother's in London. But she was always there when we wanted her, always in the background, doing her own ploys, and because she took pleasure in so many different things in the day, we took pleasure in them also. Pigeons and tame birds that came to her when she went out, and her big dogs and her flowers, and her beautiful embroidery of bright butterflies and flowers. Everything she touched or came in contact with became alive, even the chairs and the curtains, and the little china bowls. There was one chair in the drawing-room that was called the little chair. It was a little old chair of white-painted wood, with a high back and very low seat, and she had covered it herself with an old piece of Mary Geraldine's gold brocade. This chair was not one of Mary Geraldine's. It had lain forgotten in a box room till Cousin Delia found it, but now it was a friend. So many things at Yearsley were like that. Another thing about Cousin Delia was the way she took us as we were, and did not seem to want us different and better all the time, as I do with my children, except perhaps John. We were never afraid to say anything to her, for she was never shocked or disappointed with us. I wonder sometimes if she did disapprove of anything, or merely never thought of what she disliked. I did not realize this so much until I married Walter, and found that he and his mother disapproved of so many things, and of course my mother did also, though differently. She would read to us in the evenings, when it was too dark to be outside, sitting by the fire in the long drawing-room, with the lamp beside her. I can see her now distinctly if I shut my eyes, in the high-backed armchair, her chin resting on her hand, and her elbow on the arm of the chair. The lamplight would fall across her hair and shine redly through her fingers onto the book, and the ends of the room would be dark. Guy and Hugo would be lying on the floor, Hugo almost always on the hearth-rug with his chin in his hands, Guy more sideways, nearer the lamp, and I would be on a footstool beside the fender. The crackling of a wood fire, wet sap spurting in the logs, the slight warm smell of an oil lamp brings those evening reads back to me, so vividly, even now that I could cry to know how long ago they are, and how hopelessly past. The books she read to us were very vivid. Burnt Nahal, The Morte d'Arthur, Treasure Island, Ivanhoe, Some I remember particularly, and sometimes poetry, but Guy did not care for poetry much. My mother used to say that Cousin Delia was a stupid woman. "I have no patience with these beautiful cows," she said once, but I do not believe that at all. She could not have read to us as she did, and made us understand and enjoy the book so much, if she had been stupid. I am not clever, I know, and it might not have mattered to me, but it would to Hugo, and I know he never felt her so. He loved her as much as I did, and admired her as much, and Hugo understood people almost always, I think. After the reading, we would go up to bed, running and chasing each other across the high, shadowy hall and up the wide stairs. We had candles with glass shades, so the grease did not drip when we ran. Sometimes I was frightened when I was the first to run, and Guy and Hugo came after me round the great bends of that staircase, and Hugo was sometimes frightened, but never Guy. And that concludes tonight's readings. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this story. If you're not quite tired yet, please feel free to listen to another episode of the Boy to Sleep podcast. Until next time, good night.